Survival is a primal instinct, but what happens when survival becomes a punishment? What if every sunrise brings a new, unimaginable level of agony? This is the true story of Hisashi Uchi, the man who suffered one of the most horrific radiation exposures in history. His body was destroyed from the inside out, his DNA shattered, and for 83 agonizing days, doctors fought to keep him alive, long after he began begging for death. Section 1, The Blue Flash, September 30th, 1999. In Tokaimura, Japan, the day begins like any other at the JCO nuclear fuel processing plant. A team is tasked with preparing a small batch of fuel for an experimental reactor. The men are 35-year-old Hisashi Uchi, 29-year-old Masato Shinohara, and their 54-year-old supervisor, Yutaka Yokokawa. They're behind schedule, and they decide to take a shortcut. The procedure called for a uranium solution to be mixed mechanically in a specific tank, ensuring it could never reach a dangerous concentration. But to save time, the team decides to mix it by hand. In stainless steel buckets, they pour a uranyl nitrate solution directly into a much smaller precipitation tank, a container never designed to hold that much of the substance safely. The approved limit for that tank was 2.4 kilograms. In their haste, they poured in 16 kilograms, nearly 7 times the safe amount. At 10:35 a.m., as Uchi leans over the tank holding a funnel and Shinohara pours the last bucket, it happens. A brilliant, terrifying blue flash erupts from the tank. It's Cherenkov radiation, the visible sign of an uncontrolled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. They have just initiated a criticality accident. For the men in the room, the consequences are immediate. A wave of invisible gamma and neutron radiation washes over them. Uchi, draped directly over the tank, receives the highest dose. Alarms shriek through the facility as Uchi collapses, overwhelmed by pain, nausea, and difficulty breathing. The chain reaction they started would continue emitting deadly radiation for nearly 20 hours. In total, 667 people, mostly workers, were exposed to some level of radiation. But for Hisashi Uchi, his fate was sealed in that single blinding flash. Section 2, The Invisible Killer. When Hisashi Uchi first arrived at the National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Chiba, he looked deceptively intact. He was conscious and could speak. His face was a little red and swollen, and his eyes were bloodshot, but there were no major burns. The first doctor who examined him thought he might even be saved. But what was happening inside his body was a story of unprecedented biological collapse. Uchi had absorbed an estimated 17 sieverts of radiation. To put that in perspective, a dose of around 7 sieverts, even with immediate medical care, is considered lethal. At 17 sieverts, death isn't a possibility, it's a certainty. There was simply no medical precedent for a human being surviving such an assault. Radiation at this level doesn't just make you sick. It fundamentally annihilates the body's ability to sustain itself. Think of your DNA as the master blueprint for every cell in your body. It has all the instructions for making new skin, new blood cells, new organ tissue, everything. The radiation that passed through Uchi acted like a microscopic shredder, tearing these blueprints apart. 6 days after the accident, when specialists examined the chromosomes from his bone marrow, they saw total destruction. They were fragmented, shattered, and impossible to identify. His body had lost the ability to create any new cells. It was, in effect, a body with no future. And the first most immediate effect, the obliteration of his immune system. His white blood cell count, the soldiers that fight off infection, plummeted to near zero. He was left completely defenseless, a living man who, at a cellular level, had already begun to die. The doctors and nurses knew they were entering uncharted territory, facing a case that medical textbooks had never conceived of. Section 3, A Body Without a Future. Within days, the outward signs of Uchi's internal destruction began to show with horrifying speed. He was transferred to the University of Tokyo Hospital and placed in a special radiation ward. But the true enemy was already inside him. His body, unable to regenerate, began to break down. When a nurse removed medical tape from his chest, it didn't just pull off the tape, it pulled off his skin with it. This wasn't a simple tear. It was a sign that his skin was no longer regenerating. It was sloughing off, revealing the raw tissue beneath. He was losing massive amounts of bodily fluids through his disintegrating skin, up to 10 liters a day, leaving him in a constant battle against dehydration. His lungs started to fill with fluid. His digestive system was in revolt. He was bleeding internally, and even his eyes began to leak blood. The pain was immense. In a desperate, revolutionary attempt to save him, doctors performed a peripheral blood stem cell transplant using cells donated by his sister. This was an experimental procedure for a radiation victim, but it was their only hope. For a brief moment it worked. Uchi's white blood cell count started to rise. But it was a false dawn. The healthy donated cells were being introduced into a body that was itself a radioactive battlefield. The very environment of Uchi's body was so toxic that it began to damage the new cells. The ground they were meant to seed was poisoned beyond recovery. The small victory was short-lived, and his body's relentless march toward total disintegration continued. Section 4. A Living Hell. The weeks that followed plunged Hisashi Uchi into a state of suffering that's difficult to even comprehend. His body wasn't just healing badly, it was actively decomposing while he was still alive inside it. The skin grafts that doctors painstakingly applied simply wouldn't take. They would melt away because there was no underlying cellular structure to bond with. He was becoming a man without skin. Nurses had to redress his raw, weeping body every day, an agonizing process for everyone involved. He needed massive, near-constant blood transfusions just to stay alive. The pain was so extreme that he was kept in a medically induced coma for long periods. But his moments of consciousness, particularly in the early weeks, were filled with torment. He reportedly cried out for his mother and pleaded for the agony to stop. One nurse described the horror of watching him bleed from his eyes, as if crying tears of blood. The muscles began to separate from his bones. He was becoming a skeleton, loosely draped in decaying tissue, kept functioning only by a web of tubes and machines. The medical team was fighting a war they had already lost. Every intervention was a failure. The problem wasn't a single failing organ. It was that the instructions for building and maintaining any organ had been wiped clean. His body was a house whose architectural blueprints had been burned to ash. No amount of new bricks could ever rebuild it. Section 5. The Ethical Nightmare. This is where the story shifts from a medical tragedy to a profound ethical crisis. Hisashi Uchi was not a willing participant in this horrifying ordeal. During his lucid moments, he made his wishes clear. "I can't take it anymore," he reportedly said. "I am not a guinea pig." He begged doctors to stop. He wanted to go home, yet the treatment continued. But why? The answer is a complex and heartbreaking mix of reasons. A major factor was his family's wishes. His wife and relatives, watching their loved one disintegrate, clung to any sliver of hope the doctors offered. They insisted that everything possible be done. In Japan's medical system, the family's desires carry immense weight, sometimes even over the patient's expressed wishes. The doctors themselves were trapped. Their professional duty is to preserve life. But here, their every action seemed only to prolong an agonizing death. Were they honoring their oath, or were they violating the most fundamental principle of medicine? First, do no harm. Some have argued that the medical team, driven by a desire to study this unprecedented case, pushed the boundaries of ethical treatment. They were documenting every stage of his decay, learning invaluable information, but at the cost of one man's unimaginable suffering. This case forces us to ask a terrifying question. When does life-saving medicine become a form of torture? Uchi's DNA was completely gone. His skin was gone. His organs were shutting down. He was in constant, excruciating pain. And yet, machines kept his heart beating. Ventilators pushed air into his failing lungs. He was technically alive, but he was living inside a dead body. The fight to save him had become a fight to keep him suspended in a state of living death, all while he begged for it to end. Section 6. The Breaking Point. On day 59, the facade of hope shattered completely. Hisashi Uchi's heart stopped, but the medical team, abiding by the family's request to do everything, performed CPR and revived him. They brought him back, but that cardiac arrest and others that followed left him with significant brain damage. He was no longer the same. Over the next few weeks, his heart would stop 2 more times. Each time he was resuscitated. He was a man forced to die again and again and again. His body was now just a collection of biological functions maintained by machines, a vessel for suffering without consciousness. By this point, even the family began to see the futility and cruelty of the situation. The doctors gently explained there was nothing more that could be done. Finally, the family agreed to a do not resuscitate order. They would no longer fight to restart his heart if it stopped again. They accepted that the time had come to let him go. The end came on December 21st, 1999. After 83 days of a living hell, Hisashi Uchi's heart stopped for the final time. This time, no one intervened. He died from multi-organ failure. His ordeal was finally over. Hisashi Uchi's two colleagues also suffered terrible fates. Masato Shinohara, who received the second highest dose of 10 sieverts, fought for 7 months before also dying of multi-organ failure in April 2000. Only their supervisor, Yutaka Yokokawa, who received a lower dose of 3 sieverts, survived after months of treatment. The company, JCO, later had its credentials stripped, and 6 of its officials were charged with professional negligence for their role in an accident caused by a complete lack of a proper safety culture. The story of Hisashi Uchi is more than a cautionary tale about nuclear safety. It's a profound and deeply disturbing exploration of the limits of medicine and the ethics of life itself. His 83-day ordeal serves as one of history's most brutal case studies in human suffering, forcing us to ask where the line is between saving a life and prolonging a death. Just because we can keep a heart beating, does that mean we should? Hisashi Uchi's story screams from the void with the answer. There are, in fact, fates far worse than death. Thank you for watching. The questions raised by this story are complex, with no easy answers. If this video gave you something to think about, please consider liking it and subscribing for more stories that explore the intersection of science, history, and the human condition. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.